You're watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. In continuation with the conversation that just took place on Consider This few moments ago, we continue the exploration of what this means, the CSA Confidence in Supply Agreement with James Chin from University of Tasmania. This is in relation to Pakatan Harapan, and the government led by Ismail Sabri has finally put ink to paper over a confidence in supply agreement. They've just signed this agreement at 5 p.m. just now. And of course, the deal was signed by the representatives of Harapan and the government in the banquet hall of the parliament. Earlier on, we've already gotten the announcement coming in from the government as well as Pakatan Harapan yesterday, late at night. And of course, we've covered it here as well on Astro Awani, particularly on the Week Ahead show. And things are moving according to plan. And of course, because of this, we want to see what the impact is, not just to the governmental system and the parliamentary system of the country, but how it impacts you, the folks currently watching this conversation right now with me and James. James, thanks very much for taking time to speak with us. Overarching view, what do you think of this CSA deal or the confidence in supply deal?
Thank you very much for your kind invitation to talk about this. I'll start off by saying that it's a bit premature for us to make any judgments because they haven't published the full text of the agreement. What they've done is basically given us the headings of the agreements, but it looks like the press release that was released a few days ago and what was released today are totally different. So if you look at the items that was released a few days ago, they talk about 6 key items, and today they only released 5 items, which was very different. So for example, one of the items that was released today at 5 p.m. was this thing called Malaysia Agreement, and that was missing from the press release a few days ago. So again, without going into details, I think the thing we can say is that this is a major breakthrough for Malaysian politics. It's a breakthrough in a sense that this has never been done before. As to whether it will be a positive and a negative, I think it will take some time to settle down. But what I can say is that it is a good thing insofar as that it allows the government to engage the opposition at a much higher level. But on the negative side, I suspect it will constrain the opposition, especially they sign on to the dot. So many of the items that they sign on, it would appear that the government is hoping for a very, very easy passage in Parliament. And that may not be good for everybody.
Sorry, the way you say it is as if they were capitulated or co-opted into agreeing with the government. That's how you read this, is it?
No, the way I read it is, as I spoke to you a few months ago, basically Ismail Sabri is sort of still going through the honeymoon period. But the reality is that the opposition can't do much, given the fact that it's the COVID-19 thing with the election coming up, with the budget coming up. The opposition needed the deal as much as the government. So both sides really needed a deal. So that's the reason why we have a deal today. So the point is that once you sign on to the dotted line, then it's very difficult for you to criticize it when it actually appears as a paper on Parliament. So I think it'll be very difficult for the opposition to criticize the items that was agreed upon. And if the government don't go ahead and do it, there's also really nothing the opposition can do about it.
Okay, I want to understand how this works or how it will transpire in the August House. We're expecting a robust debate on any bill that is presented on the floor in the Parliament. But if things are already pre-agreed upon, does that mean that it is playing up to the theatre, that the quarrelling and the shouting and the debating is just for show, because come voting, it will still go the way of the government based on the CSA agreement? Is that how things are going to be playing out in this parliamentary sitting?
Well, the problem is that we don't have the details of the text, so it's very difficult for us to discuss this in detail. But generally, what you're assuming is absolutely right. The key parts of it will be in the agreement, and people can still argue about it in Parliament over the small parts. But by and large, once the opposition has signed on to this deal, as long as the government keep most of the key items inside the bill, then the opposition will be under an obligation to support it.
Okay, there are some things that are being shouted coming out from the MOU. the strengthening of the COVID-19 plan. The details, I'm not too sure what it means. Government transformation, again, I'm not too sure what it means. In fact, all the other items are rather overarching, right? Parliamentary reforms, judicial independence, MA 63 or Malaysia Agreement 63. The only concrete things I can see is an anti-hopping law and lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 or undi 18. I think other than these two items, nothing really shouts out as concrete items that we can actually debate on, at least at this juncture, without having the text. Do you feel that we need to have the text in order for us to, as in us being the people of Malaysia, rakyat, the ability for us to scrutinize upon what has been agreed upon?
Absolutely. I mean, the devil is always in the detail. So without the text, we're sort of talking about it in the dark. But let me just say something. There's certain items, right, which really doesn't require parliamentary approval. Things like the undi 18 is already been passed by Parliament. It's actually implementation thing. So things like that, they can actually do it very fast. The other thing that the government promised was to sort of give the leader of the opposition a higher status. Again, that's an administrative matter. But on key things like judicial independence, I suspect it will be very difficult for the government to deliver on that. Simply because under the Malaysian system, right, the judiciary is supposed to be independent of Parliament. As you know, there's three centers of powers in Malaysia: judiciary, the executive, and Parliament. So I think that will be quite difficult to deliver. But the key one that I'm really, really interested in is that how are they going to undertake government transformation during the COVID time? So I think without the details, it's a bit difficult to speak, but I suspect that is probably the most important one. The second most important one for me will probably be parliamentary reforms. And the third most important thing is, of course, Malaysia Agreement. Now, the Malaysia Agreement 63, I suspect, is pitched towards a GPS. As you know, the nominee of GPS is the law minister. And I suspect this is one of the items that GPS asked for, and they will probably get it as well. But the problem is that the number one item for the GPS is actually a constitution amendment, and that deals with the constitution amendment that did not pass through in 2019. The problem now is that it will be much harder to pass because there needs a two-thirds majority. Unless the agreement is written in such a way that everyone agrees, they may not be able to get a two-thirds majority. But I'm hopeful that they will get a two-thirds majority when they change the constitution on Article 1.2. If they can get that passed, I think it will be hugely symbolic, not only for the people of Sabah and Sarawak, but actually for the whole country.
Okay, one thing that I want to highlight is there are folks that were not at the table. Before we go any further, let's go through with who was at the table. Ismail Sabri, Tan Sri Rais Yatim, the Dewan Negara President, Ad Harun, the Dewan Rakyat President, Speaker, Anwar Ibrahim, Lim Guan Eng, Mat Sabu. There are some other MPs, all related to the PH party. Warisan, PBS, and Pejuang is not there. In fact, prior to doing this interview, Sepangga MP, also Warisan Youth Chief Aziz Jaman, argues that they were kept in the dark, as in Warisan was kept in the dark and was only invited during the final stages upon the signing of the deal between government and Pakatan Harapan. Do you feel that they were slighted or they were left out of this conversation purposely, and this should be between PH and government? Or do you feel that they were never interested to sign on in the first place?
I think they were left out on purpose. This was very much a PH thing. In particular, it's a DAP thing. As you know, this thing started off the DAP negotiating in secret with Muhyiddin through the Prime Minister's private secretary. So this is very much a continuation of that process. So the other thing to remember is that all these parties like Pejuang, Warisan, these are really minor parties, and they'll probably come on board as well once this is signed, because at the end of the day, I think during this very, very weird time in Malaysia, everybody is looking for positive news. And I think this news that the government and opposition can come together to create a better environment and recover the country faster, I think something like this will go down very well among the general public. So I think they'll come on board eventually. But at the end of the day, I suspect this is really a one-off. The second thing I will say is that I suspect that this is not a real reform, as in this is only done because of the COVID-19, because of the special circumstances that Malaysia is facing, and that the real reforms, if anything is going to come, will have to come after the next general election.
All right, we'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with James Chin of University of Tasmania. Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me James Chin. James, let's talk a little bit more about the lowering of the political temperature. It has hit boiling temperatures ever since Tun Mahathir resigned, actually, back in early 2020. And since then, the political turmoil has hit feverish levels at various levels, state, federal, at political party level. In fact, coalitions have been broken up. Parties internally have been split, and this has cut across across the board. Do you feel that this action of a federal level, first time ever done between a CSA, between the opposition, the main bloc, as well as the government, can actually lower down the political temperature?
No, I think the political temperature is really can only go on the way up because, as I mentioned earlier, we're heading towards a general election. Can I mention something here? It is quite interesting that you brought up the name of Mahathir. It's quite interesting that despite all the efforts to sideline him, he's still a major player in the process. And despite the fact that his party is very small, Perjuangan, only have a few MPs. So I suspect sooner or later they have to bring him into the political process. And as far as we know, Mahathir will probably support these arrangements because he also needs a time of stability in order to prepare Perjuangan for the coming general elections. So I think all these political parties will come on board. They're all looking for a period of stability because everybody understands that the big game is not the CSA. The big game is actually the coming general election.
Sorry, pardon me. I'm going to be sounding a little bit of a political naive here. You just said that Perjuangan is a rather small party. Why would Mahathir be significantly involved be brought into the conversation by any party right now, particularly when all the other players have 30, 40? In fact, if you collect together the blocks, they can reach up to 100 or 80 MPs together. Why is he still significant, considering that he is a man of 4 or 5 MPs from Perjuangan?
The reason why Mahathir is a significant factor is because he is such a huge brand name among the rural Malay community. Don't forget, prior to 2018, right, nobody was able to break into this duopoly between PAS and UMNO in the Malay rural area. He comes along, forms a new party, Bersatu, and they managed to capture roughly 1/3 of the rural Malay vote, essentially based on his brand name. So he's still a very strong brand name among the rural Malays. So he is always a threat to the main Malay parties. Now, you also have to remember, right, this is the guy who has started all the major Malay parties that you've seen today. People keep forgetting that the UMNO we're seeing today is not the UMNO from 1957 or the 1950s. The UMNO we're seeing today is actually UMNO Baru, the party that was built by Mahathir after the crisis in 1987. He quietly changed the name from UMNO Baru back to the original name. But basically, the UMNO you see today is Mahathir's party. Then he went on to form Bersatu, which turned out to be another major Malay party. And now he's formed the third Malay party, Perjuangan. So this is the guy who has dominated directly or indirectly Malaysian politics since the 1980s.
You know, like I said, the whole consciousness of me growing up, being an early millennial, has always been about Mahathir. It's very strange that I have to talk to my kids about Mahathir as well. And it seems like this is a ghost that is not going away anytime soon. But having said that, it seems like the general election needs to be rushed in order for this to happen, i.e. bringing Mahathir back into the relevance of the Malay psyche, particularly the Malay rural psyche. Do you feel that all this factors into the fact that GE 15 is literally just around the corner? Or do you feel that Ismail Sabri is going to stretch this until, literally when COVID-19 has been truly and well defeated in this country?
I think the reality is that you can't really defeat COVID-19. I think what happened was that a lot of policymakers, and this is not unique to Malaysia, it's all over the world, they forgot that the problem with COVID-19 is that it keeps mutating. New variants may come up. So that's the reason why, for example, in Sarawak, initially they had quite a successful COVID strategy. Then when Delta hit, everything went haywire. I think the reality is that once the majority of the Malaysian population has been vaccinated, the number of death cases have gone down, and I'm looking at towards the second half of next year, then the country will be more or less ready for a general election. If Ismail Sabri is smart, he will not wait until 2023. He will go for a general election once it is quite safe under the current SOP to hold a general election. Now, the reason why I say that is that for him, his calculation, assuming that he's still with UMNO, his calculation will be to defeat UMNO's greatest enemy, and that is Bersatu. And I think Bersatu knows that as well. So that's the reason why Bersatu is also running around trying to establish as many branches and on the ground presence as well.
Do they have the time though? They don't have the premiership. Somebody else does.
That's the reason why I said that Ismail Sabri is more likely to go for general election rather than later, because this gives the advantage to UMNO. And also you need a general election because you need to have a very, very clear mandate from the people, which is the dominant Malay party. So once that thing is sorted out, I think we will find that Malaysia will be in a much better place. Right now, there is no dominant Malay party. On the opposition side, even though they're more united, their leader, for whatever reasons, will never get a chance to be prime minister. So there's lots of instability in the system. So once the system is a bit more stabilized, I would argue that this is really the time to go for general election. Malaysia cannot survive over the long run with this sort of instability in the system.
All right, one more short break before we conclude our conversation with James Chin for the evening. Thanks for staying on with us. I have with me Professor James Chin, the Professor of Asian Studies and the inaugural Director of the Asia at the University of Tasmania. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia. And of course, he was previously the Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, or ICS, Singapore. James, let's move on to the core issue of this show, which is basically on the business community, on the international community looking into Malaysia right now. Do you feel that because of the CSA being signed at the federal level for the first time, do you think that because people are now settling down, the parliament is in session, we're going to be listening to RMK 12, we're going to be listening to the budget coming up very soon. In fact, just today, I've received 3 emails from corporates sending their wish list, and it just struck me that this is it. The moment corporates start sending in to the press their wish list, it's budget season already. So that's what it is we are at right now. Do you feel that corporates and of course the international community are seeing things falling into place? Is Malaysia back on track when it comes to the economic recovery right now?
The answer is no. Malaysia still has a long way to revive its economy. I think for the domestic corporate sector, I think they see today's agreement in really positive terms. But I think for the international community, since February 2020, since the first Perikatan government, I think the attitude of the international investors is a wait-and-see attitude. They really want to see Malaysia return to long-term stability rather than short-term stability. So I think for the international community, I don't think they're ready to come back to Malaysia. But I think for the domestic investors and the domestic businesses, I think they see this as a really, really positive thing. Now, in terms of the budget, I suspect that because a lot of things have to be negotiated with the opposition, we will find that the budget will contain a lot more goodies. Because I think for the opposition, the key items they're really worried about is really the Malaysian SMEs. The Malaysian SMEs were sort of left out in the first two waves of budget support. So I think we will see a much larger support for the SMEs. And anyway, the SME is the bedrock of the Malaysian economy. If you don't look after them, then Malaysia will be in big, big trouble.
There's also a lot of focus on corporates, big corporates. Last year, we missed the window of opportunity to tax a windfall tax on the rubber companies. This year, it doesn't seem likely that there's going to be any windfall tax. There's also that whole tricky issue of GST. We all know that progressive taxation is always a better tax system for the country, but because of political temperature, that might not see the light of day, at least anytime soon. So there are good things that needs to be done but can't be done, and there are good things that needs to be done but will not be done. Do you feel that these 2 items are going to be the handicap moments for at least Tengku Zafrul in trying to outlay a better way of trying to get income for the budget 2022?
No, I think budget 22 is all about throwing more money into the economy to restart the economy. Let me put it this way. I think there's a general consensus in Malaysia now that if you don't revive the economy, then there are no taxes to be collected. So it's better to throw big money into the economy now, revive the economy. Once business is doing that well, then your tax receipts will go up. The problem is really over the long term. Now that you've thrown a lot of the money into the economy, this means that your debt level will rise up. So in the future, you may have to find new sources of revenue. And that's where your question comes in. Do we have to bring back things like GST or progressive taxation again? But that's really over the horizon. We're talking about something that will happen 3 or 4 years down the road. As you know, Malaysian politicians have a very short memory, a very short time frame. So they'll probably be looking at a budget purely to try to revive the economy over the next 12 months.
All right, James, thank you very much. Any final word before we conclude our conversation?
No, I think this is a really positive thing, but again, the devil's in the details. I do not think that the political temperature will go down, but I also believe that the opposition will be constrained after they sign this. It's really up to the government whether they want to deliver or not, and the opposition really doesn't have any hold over the government if they don't reform the system or they don't deliver any of these items. But my take is that they'll probably deliver one of the 2 major items before the next general election.
Thank you very much. That was Professor James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the inaugural Director of Asia at the University of Tasmania in Australia.